Nicholas Stern has once said, and I quote, "Climate change is the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever seen. That means that an issue that we once thought was purely environmental has spilled over to economical. To combat and prevent further damage, financial systems are progressively and actively trying to direct capital towards green finance. This prevalent issue has led me and my teammates to our research topic, strengthening green finance in the UAE using policy incentives. This presentation is presented by me, Ali Rabi'i, and my teammates Ala Al-Shaybani and Sarah Al-Janebi, with great thanks to our mentor and professor, Monsieur Salim Boubakri. This presentation has been divided into several parts: introduction, methodology, literature review, discussion, policy implications, conclusion, and references. Each numbered from 1 to 7, so you can follow along the slides swiftly by looking at the number at the top right corner. To further introduce this topic, we must define this unclear term, green finance. It is defined as the financial support toward environmentally sustainable projects and activities, such as renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure. In the UAE, there has been significant progress in building green finance frameworks, especially in line with the country's famous goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. However, our research identifies a key issue. Regulatory frameworks exist, but they lack strong incentive mechanisms to actively drive green investment. This leads to our research question. What limitations exist in the UAE's current green finance framework, and which policy incentives could improve the mobilization of capital towards green investments? To answer this question, we use the qualitative research approach. This is because our focus is on policies, regulatory frameworks, and institutional structures. Using secondary sources of data that is publicly available, we conducted our analysis in 3 main steps. First, regulatory framework mapping. Second, comparative benchmarking. Third, barriers and incentive analysis. This approach allowed us to identify gaps in practical solutions. However, this does leave room for limitations. Since we mainly focused on regulatory design, there has been little regard to the political economy and any implementation challenges. Additionally, although we do reference and use the EU taxonomy as a benchmark, as it is the global gold standard, we must note that EU taxonomy is not perfect and thus does include small gaps.
The UAE is particularly vulnerable to climate change due to its geographical location. Even small environmental changes can have major significant impact on the economy. In response, the UAE has committed to ambitious goals, including generating 50% of energy from clean sources by 2050. This highlights how important financing sustainable projects is to the UAE. Delving deeper into the topic, a more detailed and clearer definition. Green finance refers to investments, financial instruments, and policies that support environmentally sustainable activities. Examples include green bonds, sustainable loans, and ESG investment funds. Green finance plays a crucial role in addressing climate change and contributing to broader development objectives by reducing emissions, supporting renewable energy, and achieving global sustainable goals. However, financing gaps still exist, which require strong policy support. And the strongest policy support available is the EU taxonomy. It is considered the gold standard because it includes legally binding requirements, scientific and measurable criteria, a do not significant harm principle, strong governance and oversight, social safeguards, and regular updates. This complete system reduces greenwashing and increases investors' confidence. Globally, governments use various incentives to promote green finance. This is necessary because green investments involve upfront costs, long payback periods, and high risks. Key incentives include blended finance, public and private funding, loan guarantees, public-private partnership, and low-costing financing tools. For example, the EU uses programs like InvestEU to reduce investment risks, which provide guarantees and risk-sharing mechanisms, thus helps reduce financial risk for private investors. China has expanded green bonds through strong state support and created several monetary policy tools to encourage green finance and reduce the associated risks. These incentives help attract private investors to sustainable projects. We must additionally note that international cooperation has also played an important role in promoting green finance by encouraging governments to introduce policies that incentivize sustainable investments. The UAE has made strong progress in recent years. Key initiatives include national sustainable strategies, regulatory frameworks from the Central Bank of the UAE, and the UAE Sustainable Finance Framework. There has been growth in green bonds, green loans, and ESG-linked financing. Additionally, hosting COP28 strengthened the UAE global position. using the Central Bank of the UAE framework and the UAE Sustainable Finance Working Group framework. We have found that the strongest and most prevalent principles effective management of climate-related financial risks, sustainable related disclosure principles, and climate-related financial risk management regulations. However, despite these achievements and structural limitation remains, our research identifies several major barriers. Many regulations are not mandatory, there is limited evidence of strict supervision, no clear rules preventing misleading sustainable claim, no standard definition of green, and the ESG data is limited and inconsistent, and there has been different frameworks across financial zones, and all these barriers reduce transparency, trust, and investments.
Now, onto the discussion, where all the cross-analysis and benchmarking takes place. The comparison between the UAE and the EU taxonomy shows a key difference. The EU system is mandatory and precise, while the UAE system is voluntary and principle-based. This creates a structural gap in enforcement. The EU taxonomy is legally binding, so financial institutions and companies have clearer compliance obligations. In comparison, a voluntary system depends more on the willingness of institutions to apply the guidelines. Data comparability. The EU taxonomy uses detailed technical screening criteria and measurable thresholds. This makes it easier to compare sustainable activities and assess whether investments are truly green. And investor confidence. Because the EU framework is more structured and enforceable, it reduces the risk of greenwashing and gives investors more confidence in sustainable finance products. The EU taxonomy can therefore be used as a benchmark for strengthening green finance frameworks, including the UAE system. The key difference between the EU and UAE frameworks lies in the level of discretion. In the UAE, sustainability rules can be voluntary, comply or explain, or mandatory. While this adds flexibility, it weakens credibility. First, without binding obligations, firms face no real consequences for non-compliance, reducing incentives to act. Second, it allows regulatory arbitrage, creating a race to the bottom where firms prioritize returns over sustainability. Finally, voluntary disclosure leads to inconsistent ESG data, making it difficult for investors to compare performance. In contrast, the EU's mandatory approach ensures stronger enforcement, transparency, and market discipline. Another key issue is greenwashing, which is closely linked to the lack of quantification in the UAE framework. Because there is no unified taxonomy or clear definition of what counts as a sustainable investment, firms have significant discretion. They can label activities as green based on limited criteria while ignoring broader environmental or social harm. In addition, the framework relies on general principles but lacks precise metrics or thresholds, which makes implementation subjective and inconsistent across institutions. In contrast, the EU addresses this through the do no significant harm principle and detailed science-based technical criteria. This shows that without quantification, sustainability rules remain ambiguous and can easily enable greenwashing. Finally, the UAE faces two structural challenges: fragmentation and capacity gaps. First, multiple regulators like the Central Bank of the UAE, ADGM, and DIFC create separate frameworks, leading to inconsistent rules and higher compliance costs. This can even encourage a race to the bottom, as capital flows to weaker jurisdictions. In contrast, the EU uses a single unified framework, ensuring consistency and efficiency. Second, there is a lack of technical expertise, with 31% of CEOs identifying skills and technology gaps as barriers. The EU addresses this through dedicated expert platforms and continuous updates. For the EU, improving coordination and investing in skills and research is essential for an effective system. Based on our findings, we propose to make compliance mandatory, to develop a national green taxonomy, to introduce greenwashing regulations, to adopt a do no significant harm principle, to expand blended finance mechanisms, to unify regulatory frameworks, and to invest in education and ESG capacity building.
In conclusion, the UAE has made strong progress in green finance and has clear ambitions to lead globally. However, the current framework lacks strong incentives, relies too heavily on voluntary compliance, and faces structural challenges. By implementing targeted reforms, the UAE can increase investor confidence, mobilize more capital, and accelerate its transition to a sustainable economy. Remember, green finance is not just a tool, It is a foundation for future economic development. Thank you for listening.